Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. In this episode, we're asking whether people can really have genuine emotional reactions to artificial intelligence. Many of us already feel things towards AIs, whether that's frustration with a chatbot, affection for a companion robot, or even comfort in talking to a virtual assistant. But should we take these emotions seriously? Philosopher Rebecca Wallbank joins me to explore what counts as a genuine emotion, whether our responses to AI differ from our responses to fiction, and what it means to say that these emotions might be profound. Together, we'll consider whether there's anything irrational about these reactions, and what their significance might be for our emotional lives in a world increasingly shaped by AI. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really happy to be here.
Great. So I wondered if you could start off by just telling us a little bit about what kinds of situations are we talking about? So, when might people be reacting to AI in an emotional way?
I actually think there are quite a few situations that we'll be increasingly familiar with. So the way in which you might feel guilty about not saying please and thank you to AI, the way in which we might feel really pleased when it validates the question is really interesting. And perhaps more potently, which may not quite so familiar, is when people treat AI as romantic partners and companions. So I think there's an increasing sense in which we're relying on AI for emotional comfort, and we treat them as having emotional intelligence and sensitivity. And I think this is a really interesting phenomenon which we need to take a step back from and consider whether or not this is worthwhile pursuing.
Yes, absolutely. So, there's a range of different situations there. From the, I suppose, still relatively unusual kind of case where somebody has a romantic partner, which is an AI. But, there's a lot more kind of everyday situations in which we might feel various emotions towards AI that we're interacting with. Gratitude sometimes, anger probably quite frequently, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really prevalent. The founder of OpenAI, Sam Altman, recently came out in the news asking people to stop saying please and thank yous because it's costing the companies so much money and a lot of energy resources. So, it seems to be a kind of prevalent instinct within us. And then I guess further question would be whether or not we have certain moral obligations to do so or not do so. I think there's lots of kind of knotty issues that need unpacking here.
Yeah, definitely. So that point about saying please and thank you. So this, I've got a kind of personal story about that, which is me and my partner, Bella. Hi, Bella, if you're listening. We have a kind of ongoing disagreement about whether, so both of our kids have got Google speakers, smart speakers in their bedrooms, right? And we've got this ongoing disagreement about whether they should be taught to say please and thank you to those speakers, right? And she thinks yes. And I think the basic thought is, well, if you're kind of able to be impolite to an artificial person like that, then you might be more likely to be impolite towards other people, right? So just in general, we should always say please and thank you. And therefore, we should say please and thank you to these things. I think not. And the reason I think not is because I think it might make them slightly open to manipulation in some ways. So if you're kind of taught to treat these entities as if they are agents, fully kind of moral agents, then that might lead you to be open to the companies who create and run these things manipulating you. So, you might have a case where, you're, if you, the thing is kind of expressing gratitude towards you if you spend money on something or something like that, right? And you're kind of responding in that kind of way, which I suppose brings us on to the next question I had, which is like, why might somebody worry about emotional responses to AI?
Yeah, I think there's so many interesting issues arising. The ones that you described, where we might risk treating other humans in a way that parallels the way in which we treat AI, but where this kind of crossover is negative. So where we fail to treat AI with consent, if we just ask it questions and just expect it to, serve us. And there's a danger, at least some people have thought there's a danger that we'll start doing that to AI. There's also kind of the kind of opposite danger that if we do, as you said, start treating AI as if it has sentience and emotional sensitivity, then we'll just be much more easily duped and manipulated, and kind of give it certain emotional resources that it doesn't warrant, and it's kind of costly for us. There's kind of like an overlapping fear that draws from that the more in which we emotionally invest in AI, the less we invest in other humans, and such that our emotional development becomes stunted. So the AI might just merely mirror the kind of emotional responses that we bring to it.
Right.
And so our emotional growth is stunted. And so there's this term coined by Philip Mongiani who describes how we're in danger of becoming trapped in this emotional bubble, where we're kind of experiencing a kind of restricted capacity to undergo these kind of new, complex and challenging emotions, which are really important for us. So there's like a host of these issues, which I think we need to start putting our some pressure on.
Yeah, and probably those issues might become more kind of salient or more of a concern the more of our interactions are with artificial agents rather than with other humans, right? So if we're more and more interacting with these things, if it's a kind of impoverished version of emotional interaction, then that might have consequences for us going forward.
Yeah.
And your suggestion, which I think is very persuasive, is that these worries depend on the idea that people experience genuine emotions towards AIs. And also to an extent that they experience profound emotions towards AIs. So why do you think that's what matters?
I guess I thought before we start getting really worried about these things, we should investigate whether or not these are genuine emotions and whether or not they're kind of significant for us in the first place. So kind of more straightforwardly, our emotional responses won't be wasted if we don't experience genuine emotions. But perhaps maybe more controversially, it struck me as possible that if we didn't feel genuine emotions towards these AI, we would more likely to kind of seek to return to have these interhuman reactions.
Right.
And so our emotional development wouldn't be stunted in this way. Would have the opportunities to be experiencing more kind of rich and complex emotional experiences, which are important. So I think those were kind of the thoughts I had about genuine emotions. But with respect to profound emotions, I do think those worries would be eliminated if it turned out that we experience unprofound emotions. But it's possible that the concerns would be kind of reduced. It'd still be problematic, perhaps, but just not as problematic if these emotions turned out to just have less kind of impact on us or less like valuable for us.
Yeah.
So that's what I kind of wanted to investigate, really.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I suppose, why would we doubt that we feel genuine emotions towards AI? I mean, it certainly feels like they're genuine emotions, at least some of the time, right?
Yeah, definitely. So it just struck me that some of the ways in which people talk about their interactions with AI is quite peculiar. And it's peculiar in a way that mirrors our reactions to fictional characters. So a lot of the people who describe themselves as being in love and have AI partners also admit that their AI partners are fake, or they use terms describing them as not real. And so, they often describe their interactions operating primarily in their imagination. And this, again, resembles the way in which we talk about fictional characters. We know that these fictional characters aren't real, and yet we tend to at least think we're experiencing real emotions. But in the philosophy of fiction, there's been a little kind of puzzle surrounding this. There's kind of like, there's been doubt that's shed as to whether or not these are genuine emotions. And it seemed to me that the parallel doubt applies here, So Colin Radford kind of instigated this kind of debate. He observed that ordinarily our emotions just track our beliefs about the object in question. So if I were to tell you a really, really sad story about a friend of mine, and you feel bad for my friend, and then if I were to tell you that actually the friend doesn't exist, and none of that was true, you'd very quickly stop feeling bad for the friend.
Yeah.
And this doesn't seem to happen in the case of fiction, and it doesn't seem to happen in the case of AI necessarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, people have been kind of wondering whether or not these are genuine emotions. The debate has kind of gone on, and people tend to be more along the side of they think it is a genuine emotion, but even if it is, we still need to ask whether or not these are kind of deep and profound. And so that's what I kind of wanted to kind of investigate.
It's a really interesting puzzle, isn't it? That. So, I mean, just to kind of illustrate that, I was watching the Lord of the Rings films the other day and felt myself really feeling sorry for Gollum, right? He's a really pitiful character, and you do like the way the acting is done and the CGI and everything is, really convincing, and you do feel yourself really feeling, empathy for that character. And if someone says to you, he isn't real, right? That's not the point, right? It doesn't stop you feeling that empathy.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of question whereas, as you say, if somebody was telling you about their relative and you felt sorry for them, then they said, actually, I just made that up. You would stop feeling that emotion.
Yeah, it's a really odd phenomenon.
Yeah.
And it's possible that sometimes we even feel more strongly about fictional events than real events, which is even more peculiar. And I don't know if I have an explanation for that, but sometimes the way in which the narrative is told really, it compels us. So it's, it's kind of surprising.
Good. Okay, great. And so your approach to trying to answer this question of whether we feel genuine emotions towards AI has been to go to moral philosophy or philosophy rather, and look at what philosophers have said about what emotions actually are and what makes something an emotion. So could you say a bit about what philosophers have said about emotions and how that's relevant?
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems to me that philosophers tend to describe emotions as having at least one of three components. An evaluative component where the emotions are seen to kind of serve as an appraisal or evaluation of some kind. And interestingly, some particular accounts along these lines describe the evaluation as doxastic. It requires a belief or certain beliefs about the object which it concerns, which would obviously pose problems for certain reports of emotions towards AI.
Okay, can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so this would be an approach called narrow cognitivism, which holds that in order to have an emotion, you need to have a belief about the object, or you need to believe that your emotion is warranted such that the entity that it's about has the features which you're postulating. So when you're angry or feeling shamed by something, you believe that something has caused you wrongdoing. So you believe that thing exists, or you believe that, you ought to feel embarrassed because of how that other entity will perceive you with respect to shame and anger. So it requires certain mental representations about another object, and typically, not typically, at least in some accounts, that mental representation is understood to be a belief and not just a mere imaginative episode or a thought. But of course, other philosophers have said, wait a minute, we can have these genuine emotions based on a thought or imagination. Just a kind of amusing might be enough to trigger this form of response. All that we require is a certain appraisal of some kind.
Okay.
So there's that kind of evaluative component, which is kind of clear implications for our understanding of AI. But there's also other things that might be worth looking at. So there's also a motivational component. So emotions typically seem to kind of prime us to act, shout, flee, fight, or emotionally react. So smile and cry. And you might want to question whether or not this really happens in AI, and if you think it does, whether or not it does in a same degree to as emotions towards other things. And then there's also a third component, which is the physiological or phenomenological component, when the emotions are said to be experienced in a certain manner. So they're meant to have a kind of felt like components. So these might be reflected by bodily changes, increased heart rate, or kind of shortness of breath, butterflies, and these kinds of phenomena. So you should be asking whether or not AI also kind of generates these things.
Right, yeah. So just to recap then, so we've got 3 different properties of emotions.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, we've got that it includes some kind of appraisal of the object. So if I was afraid of a dog, right, my fear sort of implies some kind of representation of that dog as being dangerous or something like that, or a threat to me, right? And that might be a belief that it's dangerous, or it might be something else, but there's some kind of appraisal of it. There's a motivational component, so it wouldn't really make sense for me to say that I was afraid of the dog if I didn't feel some kind of motivation to get away from the dog in some way, right? And remind me, what was the last one?
The kind of phenomenological, physiological component.
The physiological component, right? So being afraid of the dog might, I might be sweating and shaking or something like that. So there's kind of there's a way that it feels to be afraid of the dog, which seems embodied in some kind of way.
Yeah. So different theories might prioritize those components differently, or suggest that one's not necessary, or maybe only one of them is necessary. But I don't think we need to take a stand on the right approach on that general level, just as long as we can say that if AI were to meet each of those components, then we can be kind of rest assured that it kind of fits some model of some general model of the emotions either way.
We can take our apparent emotional responses to AI and say, well, does it seem to have that kind of sense of appraisal? Does it have the motivation? Does it have the physiological aspects? And if it has all of those, then it starts to look a lot more like it's a real emotion.
Yeah, you can start to feel a little bit more safe. Yeah.
Okay, great. So to take the first of those then, the appraisal, or perhaps the belief. So I suppose the question is it possible for us to feel genuine emotions towards AIs if we don't believe that they're sentient persons? So, for example, can we actually experience anger towards an AI system if we don't believe that it's the kind of agent that can wrong us or wrong other people, which is generally what would kind of provoke anger, right?
So the neurocognitives say no, that we can't experience genuine emotions if we don't have the requisite belief that they are the agents that can wrong us, or they have kind of other general features that would make that emotion make sense. But this view is increasingly unpopular, and so it's thought that it can't really readily account for certain phenomena that we want to describe as emotional. So in particular, it can't accommodate recalcitrant emotions very often. Right. So Patricia Greenspan kind of has more influentially observed that. So she has this case of a dog, Fido the dog, and Fido is this really gentle, toothless dog who poses no danger at all. And a subject, let's say Jane, is fully aware that Fido has no capacity to harm her. She believes this much, she affirms this much, and yet she still feels afraid of Fido. So it seems then that, the emotion of fear is generated without the kind of belief that would be required by the neurocognitivist. And so in order for the neurocognitivists to kind of make sense of this phenomena, they'd have to do a little bit of kind of gymnastics. They have to really postulate quite a significant form of irrationality to Jane. So they'd have to really, to save the theory, they'd have to postulate the belief in Jane that Fido isn't dangerous, and also the belief that Fido is dangerous. And people just think that this is really quite unfair on Jane. It's requiring a little bit too much of kind of inconsistency and irrationality on Jane's part. And sure, like, belief in contradictions is not impossible, particularly kind of when one's represented on a kind of unconscious level. But many have found like the degree to which this would be required for recalcitrant emotions just be too radical or too counterintuitive. And of course, there are other alternatives available. We don't need necessarily to postulate. I believe perhaps the imagination will just do the job, or a thought, or kind of passing evaluative appraisal. So it's often argued that just standing next to a cliff edge and just imagining what it's like to fall is enough to trigger the fear response.
Right.
And that does seem quite familiar to us. Some people have thought that emotions might be elicited kind of pre-theoretically, kind of pre-reflectively, just in a kind of like immediate reactive response. So where the reaction, this is dangerous, just takes place too quick for us to kind of process it. And so some of our emotions might be accounted for in those ways.
Okay. So like me being afraid of the dog, I wouldn't have to kind of believe that the dog was dangerous, right? It would just be a very immediate response to that dog. And there's still some kind of appraisal there, but it's not a belief, I suppose.
Yeah.
Maybe something like that.
Not a belief, and not necessarily even a thought, depending on what you understand it to be. It's just a kind of like instinctive kind of mechanism. So that might be happening. It might even be happening when we respond to AI in certain ways, like the way in which we might take comfort from like a certain chatbot's voice, as opposed to if the voice was kind of uncanny and sounded robotic. So I think OpenAI became under quite a lot of controversy last year when they tried to get Scarlett Johansson's voice, and that we don't need to go into the reason behind the controversy, but the reason they wanted Scarlett Johansson was because it would make people feel at ease and kind of more comfortable around it, which I think is not something that people would generally reflect on. They wouldn't probably think, oh, this sounds nice, then I can trust it. But we probably would trust it much more if it sounded like a voice that we can kind of relate to. And then I guess we should be asking whether or not we should be allowing AIs to trick us in this way. I mean, maybe trick us a little bit too strong, but there's an overt intention to make us feel relaxed, and maybe we shouldn't, in fact, feel relaxed around it.
Yeah, so, but the kind of, I suppose, the takeaway for this element of appraisal, or however you want to characterize it, is that it might be that we can have responses to AIs which exhibit that kind of feature without really having the belief, right? Because the way we might respond to Scarlett Johansson's voice would be pre-theoretical. It's just, it's something, it's just an immediate response. It does embody an appraisal, but it's not dependent on us having the belief that this really is Scarlett Johansson or any other real person. Yeah. Okay, great. So the second component that you were interested in then was the motivational component. So do you think that people's apparent emotional responses to AIs do have that motivational component then?
Yeah, I think there's some clear indications that we do act and kind of expressively react in response to AI. So I think we probably smile, might even laugh towards AI, quite commonly raise the eyebrows. We do kind of react in these ways, and more kind of overtly, we do act in certain ways, or at least some people describe quite a strong action. So when they're in romantic relationships with AI, they introduce the AI partner to their parents, and they might set up certain forms of augmented reality to go on picnics with the AI. So they have clear actions are taken, and so it seems that this component is also fulfilled.
Yeah.
You might question how much, or like the degree in which this always happens though, and I think this bears on issues of profundity. And maybe
we'll get to that in a moment, shall we? Yeah, so it seems at least fairly clear that in the same way that motivational component is there in ordinary emotional response, it probably is there in responses to AI as well. It just looks like responses to AIs aren't different in that respect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And then the third component was the kind of physiological or the sort of intensity of feeling component. So again, do you think we have that kind of response to AIs?
Well, ultimately, this is not for me to say. I really can't go around telling people what they do and don't feel. But it does seem to me that people report very strong feelings, very intense feelings towards AI. And again, we could maybe draw on a more familiar comparison to fiction. There is reasons to think that emotions that we feel towards entities that don't exist are intensely felt. We kind of cry and laugh over fictional characters all the time, and the same seems to be reasonable, and we've said for our responses to AI. In fact, even those who in the literature are best known for saying that we only feel kind of quasi-emotions towards fiction because of concerns relating to the motivational or evaluative component, don't want to deny that this is still genuinely intensely felt. In fact, Kendall Walton, who is most influential in arguing for the kind of quasi-emotion theory, argues that these emotions towards fictions might be more highly charged than they are to real situations. And I think that often tracks our experience. Yeah, so I think there were some good reasons to think that all of these components can be fulfilled by our responses to AI.
Right. Okay. So in terms of your kind of overall project, then you were asking, do our emotional responses or apparent emotional responses to AIs have all these features that our normal emotional responses have? And it looks like they do, or at least, they certainly can. There's no particular reason to think that responses to AIs are different in any of those respects. So, all right. So let's accept that we do experience genuine emotions towards AIs then. But the other question that you were asking is about the profundity of these emotions. So do we have any reason to think that these emotional responses are less profound than our other emotional responses?
Yeah. So, I think this is interesting. And I think it depends on what you mean by profundity. So some people just mean intensity. And in which case you can say, yes, of course, it can be equally intense.
We've already answered that one. Yeah.
But some people mean something slightly different. So David Pugmire argues that profound emotions are those which are kind of permeated and integrated across our cognitive states. So they're coherent across our beliefs, and they kind of track our broader kind of mental representations. So if we understand profundity in this way, then it seems that our emotions towards AI are going to be less likely to be profound because we don't always, or often at least, have the requisite belief that they exist and that they're deserving of these emotions.
Okay, so could you explain that a bit more? I'm not sure I completely followed that. So the thought is that profundity for emotions is something like that it tracks our overall kind of pattern of beliefs and motivations or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It kind of is consistent and coherent across our kind of representational state. So we'd not only feel that this is a wrong, we'd also believe that it's wronging us.
I see. Yeah.
And would be motivated to respond in turn. And we can see perhaps that this might have certain effects and implications. So profound emotions would then be more likely to be prolonged. Just lasting longer. And they've also perhaps be more likely to be motivating. They're more likely to cause certain actions in us. And I think there's some indication to think that our emotions towards AI are slightly less profound. Right. It's, or at least very possible that whilst they might be intensely felt, they might not necessarily be quite so drawn out. At least when we compare it to fiction, our emotions towards fiction can be really, really intense, and then we just go off and eat popcorn.
Yes, okay.
We don't really necessarily dwell on them for quite the same amount of time. And similarly, when we engage with fictions, we might not necessarily act too drastically. We won't run out on stage and try and stop someone from getting stabbed. And interestingly, whilst people do take clear actions towards AI, they don't take all the actions. They don't necessarily kind of go as far as you would when there's a real person. And I think this clearly makes sense because you don't have the belief that tracks it. So there was a really interesting case that occurred when Replica went under kind of upgrades. So Replica is this chatbot program where it kind of encourages AI companionship. And loads of people are very much reliant on these Replica for daily companionship and interaction. And then they'd create their companion in the kind of image of their choice. So they'd kind of create it as sassy, or they'd have certain kind of other features and interests. And so they'd have all of these kind of personalized communication. And then the chatbots went offline for a little bit. And then lots of the Replica users were understandably very distraught. They were really upset. They described on all of these chat forums how their friend had been kidnapped or brainwashed because they'd in the place of the personal chatbot, they'd just put a general and generic chatbot to
Right,
them.
right.
And they were really distraught. And yet nobody called the police. Nobody took any further actions. No legal action was taken, I don't think, which I think is kind of interesting. Maybe it's understandable, and they might be motivated to act without actually acting further because there's no further capacity to act.
Yeah.
There's no kind of way in which this would be reflected in law. But it's possible that the emotions that are experienced are slightly less motivationally compelling. That's
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose it's a bit speculative, isn't it? Because it's hard to get into the kind of mindset of somebody in that situation in the first place, right? But it does seem plausible that while the kind of immediate emotional response might be something a bit like grief, right? Because you're talking about kind of people who've been interacting in a fairly deep way with some AI system which has become an individual for them, right? And then suddenly that individual is not there anymore, right? So there probably is quite a strong emotional response to that being taken away. But like you say, it's probably not going to be as long lasting or as profound as it would be if it actually was a human being, right? So, I mean, there's the question about what would the motivational component and I suppose the belief component come into play there, don't they? Because presumably these people don't believe that these systems are sentient for the most part. I mean, maybe some do, but we shouldn't assume that they do.
Yeah.
So calling the police would be irrational then, because like there's nothing the police can do about it.
Yeah.
But also, it seems like there also seems to be just something on the level of kind of depth and sort of long lastingness of feeling. Whereas if a person who you're in a relationship with dies, then that's something that's going to last the rest of your life. It seems less likely that that's going to be the case in this scenario.
It's certainly possible. I mean, as you say, it's a little speculative, but it's possible given the absence of belief that these emotions are just less, less integrated and so less kind of likely to kind of cohere in a manner that is prolonged and kind of deep.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, okay, great. If the conclusion that we should reach then is that we do have genuine emotional responses to AIs, but they're at least kind of typically less profound than our other emotional life in some sense, what are the implications then for how we should feel about AI? Should that mean that we should be less worried about our interactions with AI, or in some ways more worried? What do you think?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I guess when I started out thinking about these things, I hypothesized that we should feel less worried. The thought was, if we fail to find something quite so profound, less perhaps deep and perhaps meaningful, then we'd be more likely to seek interactions from other human companions. And maybe we shouldn't pretend that all human interactions are deep and meaningful, but there's at least a possibility for emotional and social and moral growth. And we wouldn't necessarily have stunted opportunities for such things. And fears of emotional exploitation would be perhaps diffused if these emotions were less kind of impactful on our lives. But there's reason to think that maybe the matter's not quite so straightforward. So actually, I had some really interesting conversations with Luke Frenning from the Idea Centre here.
A previous interviewee on this podcast as well, yeah.
Yeah, he suggested that the absence of profound or genuine emotions would actually be far more dangerous than I suggested. So his thought was that, well, suppose we don't experience profound emotions, but some kind of shallow emotion, or maybe not even emotion at all, but something like a thrill or a feeling of gratification, then I guess our experience could be somewhat comparable to just a dopamine rush, something comparable to the way in which we experience social media, and the way in which getting likes on a social media post is really rewarding, just kind of being kind of pacified and kind of experiencing the sense of kind of validation from AI, which you often do, would be kind of all enthralling and all consuming, and yet very much lacking as a good supplier for our emotional needs. And it is interesting to see that was in the news quite recently that AI's, or at least an update from OpenAI, had to be reversed as it was found to be too sycophantic, and people were just finding it far too praising and kind of so I think it was described as disingenuous,
right?
And by the founder, and I think that's really quite interesting because it's not entirely clear what it'd mean for it not to be disingenuous.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's this sense in which AI will just kind of like tell us what we want to hear in a way that's somewhat problematic. And so Luke feared that if we want to feel genuine emotions or profound emotions towards AI, then our emotional kind of like experience would be somewhat simplified and shallower when we just gain these cheap thrills, I guess, and miss out on important kind of human experiences, which are challenging and complex.
Yes.
So,
I can see that.
So the more we rely on AI, kind of, the more
the more our kind of emotional life in general is impoverished because we're not having the richness, and we're having a simplified kind of one which is sort of tailored towards hitting what we immediately think we need, but might not be giving us what we actually do need on a deeper level.
Yeah, and I really like this concern, and I think it makes sense, but also I just wonder if it's just a little bit too skeptical. I think I'm slightly more optimistic about humanity and our drive for meaningful and kind of deep connections. So I think it's also true that social media has proven addictive. It's also true that we tend to be quite aware of this and trying to resist it. And, we try and have social media blackouts and turn our phone off. And I think if we were to notice a similar effect in AI, I think it's very possible that we're going to try and seek slightly more challenging and complex interactions with humans. I'm hopeful that we're going to, try and separate ourselves from too much reliance on AI. Although that's not entirely. I mean, this is a little speculative again, but that's my hope.
That's your optimistic take. Yeah. Okay, great. I suppose, one other thing that occurred to me is so there's been a comparison with fiction, right, running through this whole conversation, and I suppose we might take away the conclusion that our emotional responses to AIs are perhaps no more, but also no less profound than our emotional responses to fiction, right? But we don't worry about our responses to fiction in the same kind of way. So is there something different going on here, or maybe should we be more worried about our responses to fiction?
Well, so when I first started thinking about this, that was the kind of conclusion that I wanted. I wanted it to be, well, we're not too worried about fiction, so let's relax a little bit. But I have to say, the more I think about it, the more I think maybe we should be a little bit worried, because obviously AI is significantly different in the fact that it can interact with us, and it can also instigate interaction in the way that fiction just can't. We can just close the book and put it away. Yeah. But we can't plausibly do that with AI. You know, it might be programmed to kind of give us notifications, like the chatbots might send you a random message throughout the day saying, hope you're having a good day. Yeah. And this then would be kind of harder to kind of distance ourselves from and separate ourselves from in a way that might be valuable and needed. I saw an interesting TED talk by the founder of Replica, who kind of observed that this problem might be more and more prevalent, which is interesting for her to admit it. And she suggested that we just start to fight fire with fire. She's like, well, let's just embrace AI and program it to encourage us to do other things. And so, like, we should program it to encourage us to do other things we value, like take a walk in the forest or reach out to our friend. And I guess I'm not too optimistic that this is the right way to go. I mean, I guess it's fine to use AI as a kind of calendar or planner, giving us reminders to do these things. But I don't know if, like, just embracing more AI is the right way to go to kind of stopping the bad effects of AI. I mean, I don't know if I have an alternative solution, but I guess I'm just hopeful. It just seems very possible to me that if we find ourselves kind of with kind of emotionally unsatisfied needs, or where we have these unsatisfied rather, and we just find these AI interactions just not entirely fulfilling in the ways that we have found interactions with humans, then we'll seek a return to the kind of the current status quo, this current normality that we have. So in that case, the kind of pessimistic concerns that we kind of raised at the start about emotional development and exploitation would maybe be reduced. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's hope.
Let's hope so, and let's end on that optimistic note then. So that's been a really fascinating conversation. So Rebecca Wallbank, thanks very much for being on the pod.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.